course. Let's talk now to Nabila Ramdani, who is a French-Algerian journalist, columnist, broadcaster who specialises in French politics, Islamic affairs and the Arab world, and who is living in London. Hello to you.
Hello.
First of all, how do you respond to what happened on Friday in the capital of your country?
Well, let's be perfectly honest. My first thought was that I was glad I wasn't there. I live in London most of the time, but I do go back and forth an awful lot. My family is still there. My parents, my sister, my brothers, my friends live in Paris. And the first reaction was to say, thank God, I am in London and I am safe. But I also make sure to call family members and friends to make sure that they were not, caught in this tragedy. And in fact, I spoke to my sister and she said to me that she was about to go out with girlfriends around that time in the Bastille area, and they got lazy about it and they remained, away from the capital city. But I also called my younger brother, who lives in Paris, and told him to stay at home because there was no indication at that point that the attacks were over by any means. There could be further attacks, and as it happens, there is an ongoing crisis still with one of the terrorists at large with accomplices. So it's very much an ongoing threat, and I wanted to make sure that he's a distinctive-looking Arab young man. Let's be honest about it, and there's always going to be a risk of him either being arrested or indeed be the victim of violence because of retaliation attacks.
Right. That's interesting that you talk about retaliation. Is that an inevitability, do you think?
Well, I think there's always going to be people who would want to link the Friday the 13th attacks and, try to stigmatise entire communities because of the background of the perpetrators of the attacks. And to give you some staggering figures, after the Charlie Hebdo attacks, within hours of the Charlie Hebdo attacks, there were already arson and indeed grenade attacks against mosques in France. In the 6 months following the Charlie Hebdo attacks, physical assaults against Muslims have increased by 500%. There was also an increase of 100% of verbal abuse against Muslims. Women wearing headscarves were particularly targeted, including children who refused to, do the minute silence in classrooms for the attacks because they didn't particularly felt they were with Charlie Hebdo. On that case, they felt they were not Charlie. They were plucked out of classrooms and taken to police stations for interrogation. And we're talking about children aged from 8 to 12 years old.
But this feels different, don't you think?
It does. It does feel very different because of the nature of the attacks. It was very much indiscriminate, rather particularly sinister because of the targets. It's very easy to go about and attack unarmed civilians with gunfire and indeed grenades. And the very nature of the attacks makes it the most cowardly attack possible. And I think there will be a different feel to Paris. There is, of course, a determination to put a resilient front and to say never again. But we heard that slogan back in January with marches across Paris. And it was highly symbolic, it was necessary. But I think the French would now expect more than tokenistic marches or indeed slogans, or indeed tokenistic police presence on the streets. They expect the government to do much more than that, and that includes, intelligence, proper intelligence on the ground.
Let me ask you about some of the information that is coming out this morning, that one of the men, Sami Amamour, went to Syria a couple of years ago and in fact was certainly on the radar of the authorities because he was under judicial supervision until 2013 and then somehow dropped off the radar.
Well, indeed. There is something depressingly familiar and indeed predictable about the profile of the terrorists, not only those involved in these attacks, but also, as we've seen with the Charlie Hebdo attacks. Invariably, they tend to be young French men of North African background who live on housing estates, so very much deprived areas, They tend to come from troubled backgrounds as well, involved in petty criminality, not particularly religious, but also with a track record of radicalization, which also at times includes spending time abroad, including in devastated countries like Syria or indeed Iraq, or in any case countries where they can have an affiliation with organizations like ISIS or Al-Qaeda.
I mean, there is still a heck of a leap, isn't there, from growing up in a deprived suburb of Paris and then 15, 20 years later turning up with a suicide vest and a Kalashnikov to kill Muslims, Christians, French people, Algerian people, British people, Americans at a rock concert, for example.
There is indeed, but I think there are also there are clues that you cannot ignore, and that includes the radicalization aspect. Once the police, I mean, again, invariably, these young people are known to the security services. They often have spent time in prison, so they're on and off prison most of the time. But I think the radicalization aspect makes them particularly interesting for the security services, as in, you know, people who should be monitored properly, and indeed trips abroad to countries like Syria, for example. That is not innocent. And dare I say, it takes a handful of sociopaths from that background to absolutely wreak havoc. These are people who, in their mind, their view, have nothing to lose, you know, and there's a tacit agreement that they are prepared to kill as many people as possible, and they are prepared to die themselves. And may I just add as well that after the Charlie Hebdo attacks, we've heard from the Prime Minister of France, Manuel Valls. He spoke very frankly and bluntly about an ethnic, territorial and social apartheid in France. He spoke about the banlieue, the high-rise estates, characterized by delinquency, discrimination and indeed poverty, which is a fertile ground for fertile territory for people who can become liable to carry out
vulnerable to radicalisation.
Just
to say, your French Interior Minister Bernard Cazeneuve is about to hold a press conference in Paris. We will cross to that live when he begins. Why do you think Paris again? What are your thoughts on that?
To be perfectly honest, you know, if you, I mean, I'm sure there are many reasons, but there is also an intrinsic link, it seems, between foreign policy and domestic affairs. And there is certainly a relation there between France's decision to tackle an extremely serious problem, a global problem that is barbaric, you know, radicalism linked to groups like ISIS and, you know, carrying strikes in their territory in eastern Syria and western Iraq, and indeed, you know, the perception that it is an unjust crusade, as it were, and it is yet another attack on Muslim countries. And that in itself, you know, we know that groups like ISIS have mastered the art of communication, and they can certainly use that as a propaganda tool and to recruit vulnerable minds.
Thank you very much for talking to us. Thank you. Nabila Ramdani, who's a French journalist living in London. This news just coming in.